Hello, in this screencast presentation for Sustainable Settlements, I'm going to be talking about healthy and sustainable transport and mobility. In this week's session, I'm going to be covering the scale of benefits linked to mobility and transport networks and talking about those framed as health benefits, the role of land use planning as a process in the development of sustainable transport, the way that public transport links to improved health, both of communities and environments, the importance of walkability and what we mean by active travel, and then approaches that are holistic in terms of urban design to support healthy modal choice. And by modal choice, that just means which mode of transport or mobility a person chooses. So in terms of talking about benefits, I'm going to be using the concept of health as a frame. So by frame, that just means a way of looking at an issue. And the reason I'm choosing health is because we can think of health both in terms of the way that we understand human health, but we can also understand health in terms of the environmental health and the health of urban ecosystems that include people, naturalistic environments, other life forms such as plants and animals, air quality, water quality, and all the things that make up a healthy urban ecosystem. So when we talk about health, we are using a really broad sense in terms of you know, providing healthy cities for the future, both in terms of human and non-human populations. So when I talk about scales of benefit and in using health as a frame, we are talking about this. This diagram really helps to think about what we mean by scale. So we're talking about health benefits to the individual, health benefits to the wider neighbourhood, and the size of the development that you're going to be designing at the end of the module is around a neighbourhood scale. Health benefits to the wider city of which the neighbourhood belongs, and also thinking about even broader than that, kind of planetary health. I'm going to jump straight into one of the most contentious and thorny issues when we're talking about sustainable transport, and that is that we are now in an era of reducing car use. And for some of us who've been working in kind of the area of sustainable cities for a while now, we're unapologetic about that, even though we accept that it's a really difficult and sometimes quite frightening thing to think about reducing car use. But certainly in terms of how we operate within cities, there's a very strong case now for actually trying to reduce car use rather than just make space for it. The benefits of reducing car use include a reduction in road traffic accidents, so that's a direct health benefit to the people that would be involved in those, and that's a real significant risk for both pedestrians and other road users. But then we're also thinking about if we reduce car use, we improve active travel and we reduce what we call sedentary modes of travel. So getting in the car that's parked outside your house or getting in a taxi that's outside your house and travelling right to the destination, getting out and into the building is probably the least active way of travelling between 2 points. And of course, none of this is to exclude issues for people with limited mobility. And when we're talking about reducing car use, we're not talking about getting rid of any kind of cars. We're talking about reducing the number of cars on the road. But that still leaves plenty of space for people who have limited mobility and need to use vehicular transport to get around. So if we can reduce the amount of cars, we can improve the levels of active travel, make it safer on the roads for other forms of transport and also for pedestrians and children travelling to school and travelling to the park. The next level of health really starts to impact not only on the individual level, but also on this kind of wider community, city, and global level, and that is a reduction in emissions. So if we can cut down cars, then we can reduce the localized emissions. But if we can also reduce car use, then we can reduce the emissions associated with the production of those vehicles as well. There is certainly room for thinking about the role of electric vehicles and self-drive electric vehicles in the future of cities, but it's also important to remember those whole life cycle environmental impacts of car production as well as car use. So we want to reduce the number of cars on the road, because of the amount of carbon involved in producing them, as well as the amount of emissions that they produce when they drive around. Cars compete for space with walking, cycling, and public transport. So there's a direct spatial issue here. Even if we were to have cars produced using the cleanest technologies and powered by renewable energy, renewable electricity, the problem of them, the amount of space that they take up, is still significant. So the reason that roads are so dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists, and the reason that public transport can often be slow and inefficient, is because of the number of cars on the road. So there's a direct competition there for space. It's also true that if we're wanting to look at theories like compact cities, which is essentially, as it sounds, that we live at higher densities, we travel smaller distances, and we transport goods over smaller distances, then cars really challenge that. So the amount of space that they take up, the amount of space that they need in terms of parking and driving around, makes it quite difficult for us to build compact cities. Public transport as a modal choice, as an option instead of individual cars, is a really important one. It's important to remember that public transport is actually part of an active travel network. So when we're looking at things like the 20-minute neighbourhood, which you will be reading about ahead of next week's session and which we're going to be talking about later, then we're looking at the connectivity between pedestrian modes, cycle modes, and public transport networks. Obviously, some things that people need to access are a long way away from their homes and places of work and that kind of thing. So we're not suggesting that people walk or cycle everywhere. People do need to use other forms of transport. But if we can connect public transport networks with pedestrian and cycle paths, then we can start to increase active travel as well as reduce the number of cars on the road. Public transport supports this idea of compact city. So it's a higher density form of transport than individual cars. If you have a lot of people living in a small area, then you can transport those people more efficiently using mass transit, as it's called in some parts of the world, or public transport, as we call it in the UK. An example of this would be the city of New York. So we know that North Americans really like their cars still, and a lot of their cities are designed, things like Los Angeles are still very much designed for car use. But most people who live and work in New York City, in Manhattan in particular, do not drive. They rely upon the mass transit system of New York. And that's because it simply isn't efficient or possible for all the people that want to travel around that city to do so in individual cars. If we improve the public transport network, then we can encourage people to swap out their cars, and it takes cars off the road. The other thing that public transport infrastructure actually does is it increases opportunities for social interaction, and it can help to reduce isolation. So that's been something that's been quite interesting through the previous 18 months of the COVID pandemic, when public transport was rejected by many people for that very reason, in that it brings you into contact with other people. But hopefully, as we move forward and things get better around the pandemic, we can start to think of social interaction as a positive again. And for a lot of people who live alone, actually engaging in things like, catching a bus or catching a train or a tram, it's an opportunity to see other people and actually to be involved in a community. When we talk about walkability, we are actually including other forms of active travel as well, such as skating, cycling, using mobility aids, scooters, and running. So really, we're talking about the kinds of transport options that don't involve getting on either on a public transport infrastructure or getting into a car. There are lots of benefits of having what we call a walkable neighbourhood, and they're all detailed here on this diagram. Again, this uses that idea of the scales of benefits. So we see benefits to the individual, benefits to the community, and benefits to the environment. So there are obviously direct health benefits from moving your body and engaging in active travel. It's actually cardiovascular exercise taking place, and it's generally good for our health. But also, making places walkable encourages people to, again, give up their cars and makes it possible for us to create more space in those neighbourhoods for more environmentally beneficial activities and functions. The idea of the neighbourhood has really gained a lot of traction, especially through the pandemic, where people have tended to travel more locally for a long period of time. Lots of people gave up using public transport unless they absolutely needed to get to work using public transport or to hospital and that kind of thing. But we've really started to see an increased interest in the neighbourhood, and that is quite in line with some of the urban sustainability concepts that we'll be looking at on the module. So when we think about designing a holistic and accessible neighbourhood, we're really thinking about that transport infrastructure. It sits at the heart of this idea of a kind of healthy and sustainable neighbourhood design. The concept of the 20-minute neighbourhood is something that I'm asking you to read about ahead of the class this week. It's one way of kind of framing and conceptualizing this idea of a compact but accessible and sustainable neighbourhood design. The idea, of course, is that roughly everything that somebody needs within an area should be accessible within 20 minutes by foot. If we think about that as a design principle, that has some pretty profound consequences for the shape and scale of cities. Now, obviously, we're not saying that everything has to take place within the neighbourhood, but certainly a lot of the things that people need to access in their day-to-day lives should be accessible within their neighbourhood and should be accessible by some form of active travel. I'm going to give you a quick case study of the city of Freiburg. Freiburg in Breisgau in southern Germany, and you may well have heard of Freiburg. It's used quite often as a case study for sustainable urban design and sustainable neighbourhood design in particular. So Freiburg is a really interesting case study for transport because it unapologetically waged war on the car quite a long time ago. So in Freiburg, there is an area in the city centre that is completely car free. And it's very expensive to park your car close to the city centre. And there are also car restricted neighbourhoods on the outskirts of Freiburg city centre. So the first thing that Freiburg did then was to unapologetically, as I say, wage war on the car, reduce car use. But it didn't just reduce car use, it also produced and sustained and developed and supported through things like subsidies a really well integrated, reliable and affordable public transport infrastructure. So the centre of Freiburg is car free. It's also bus free. The only vehicles that are allowed in the centre of Freiburg are obviously emergency vehicles and mobility vehicles, but mainly trams and bikes and pedestrians. So that's the majority of the vehicles and modes of transport in the city centre. All of the tram networks link up to buses, and they have an integrated network and timetable. And the tram network also is integrated with the rail network. So you can use one ticket to catch a train and a tram and a bus within the city to get where you need to. And as I say, their timetables are integrated as well. And all of those public transport fares are heavily subsidised by the government. So there's not only a disincentive to use the car in Freiburg, there's a very strong incentive to use public transport and other forms of transport, such as active travel modes like particularly cycling. So cycling is very, very strongly supported in Freiburg. As you can see here, some examples of people cycling around the city. There are priority cycle routes throughout the city and throughout the neighbourhoods. There's also a lot of secure bike storage. The city itself is designed to be compact enough that you can access most areas on bike, and it's pretty flat. So it's surrounded by mountains, but the actual urban area itself is pretty flat. So it's very safe to travel and by bike. It's very easy to store your bike, and there is incentivized by the fact that there are no cars on most of those areas where you see very rarely sharing space with cars when you're on your bike, which is one of the most intimidating things for cyclists in places like the UK. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some interesting aspects of sustainable transport, the benefits of doing it, why we try to think about sustainable integrated transport networks that include both vehicles and active travel modes. Here are some of the key texts that I have referenced today. They're all available through the Library Gateway, and some of them are also on the module reading list. So I hope that was interesting. I look forward to seeing you in class.